Borsella and Dr. Diaz. Thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Feeney.
Great, thank you. Today's presentation is about literacy in the Port Washington School District. In many ways, the presentation will be it's an instructional aspect, so we can develop a common understanding, common language. You've heard in different presentations us talk about different aspects of literacy and literacy instruction. We want to share some of the research related to literacy. We want to talk about where we have been as a district, where we are, and where we're going. As you mentioned, we have Dr. Borsella, who's our administrator for literacy in the district, as well as Ms. Diaz, who's our director of elementary curriculum for the district, who will be helping us with this presentation. So I'm going to switch over. Let's get the presentation up. Okay. So as this switches over, overview, you'll see just we got about 8 sections of this presentation, from foundational information about literacy and all the way to the end regarding where we're going moving forward as a district. So we'll start with the foundations. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Borsella.
Okay, so what is literacy? Really, that quote or statement on the bottom of the slide really speaks to what literacy is. Our journey begins with strong readers who think critically. Literacy is more than just reading, right? It's reading, writing, speaking, listening, comprehension. It's really the foundation of the rest of your learning. And today, when we think about literacy, we can't just think about opening up a textbook and reading the print in front of us. We also have digital literacy we have to think about. And students that really don't have very good reading and literacy skills are really going to struggle with access to opportunities as well as knowledge. Okay. So literacy instruction is really the most important curriculum component of early childhood. Learning how to read, write, and communicate effectively is the foundation for everything else, like learning math, science, social studies. If you've seen the math exam, it's more than just computation. You have to be literate in order to pass that exam now. Literacy is the #1 marker for later success in life, both academically and socially. Studies show that students with low literacy rates have can experience higher opportunities of unemployment, incarceration, even nutritional deficiencies, health issues. Studies also show that students with higher literacy levels are more likely to graduate high school, and there will be less dropout rates. Okay, on the next slide, I'm going to be speaking about the components of a skilled reader. So in order to be a skilled reader, you really need these 6 pillars or components of reading. I'm going to go through them so we all have a common language of what we're talking about when we go forward. So when you think about phonemic awareness, I want you to think about auditory skills. So phonemic awareness is really the ability to hear and break down individual sounds in words. So if a teacher's teaching a student phonemic awareness, they're not going to have like a pen and pencil in front of them. Everything is going to be auditory that the student and teacher are doing. Phonics is the understanding of letters and sounds and the relationship between the two of them. That's really where decoding starts. Fluency, when the teacher says to you, oh, your student needs to, or your child needs to be more fluent when they're reading, they're talking about reading rate, accuracy, and reading with expression. Vocabulary is knowing and understanding a wide range of words in front of you. And there's also something called content vocabulary. So in math, there's going to be certain vocabulary, science, and social studies. Comprehension is understanding and interpreting written text. and oral language. A lot of people forget about the importance of oral language and speaking. English is not an easy language to learn. When we look at English, there's 44 phonemes in our English language, and I did like some comparisons here. In Arabic, there's 36, in Mandarin, there's 29, and in Spanish, there's 24. So when people say that English is a difficult language, it really is, because we have the most amount of phonemes.
And a phoneme is what?
A phoneme is the individual sound in a word.
It's a sound, okay.
Yep.
As opposed to the rules, which are very.
Correct, that's completely different, yep. So there's been a lot of buzz about Education Law 818. And what this new law says is that school districts have to align their instruction and their practices with the Big Six that New York State put out. And our instruction needs to be scientifically based in grades pre-K to 3. Because when you think about reading, I think about reading as if I'm building a house, right? You're gonna start with the foundation and then work your way up to floor 1, 2, 3, the attic. You're not gonna start building a house on the second floor because it's gonna crumble without a good foundation. And also districts must submit an attestation. So what this means is New York State is really holding school districts accountable now. If you look at the literacy rates, not only in New York State, but nationally, only 31% of our 4th graders are reading proficient according to the ELA exam. 31% are passing. In Port, Juanita's going to go over some of the data in Port, is much better than, national average. But if you look at some of our subgroups, we're pretty much on par with the national average. Okay, next slide. Okay, so it's important to understand the difference between scientifically based and evidence-based. So scientifically based means that the instructional method or practice is based on research. It means that their practices are grounded in rigorous peer-reviewed research, and you're able to replicate the study. Evidence-based means it's shown to work in real classrooms. And our instruction in Port Washington needs to reflect both. It needs to be both evidence-based and scientific-based. Do you want me, I could talk about the purpose. Well, like I said, the purpose is to ensure practices are built on a strong foundation. When you talk about evidence, scientific-based, and when you talk about evidence-based, you're ensuring that it's used in real life. Okay, the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the research on how students learn. This video is going to discuss how the brain works in terms of reading.
What do we know about the complex process of learning to read? Surprisingly, a lot. Scientific research collected over the past 4 decades reveals what happens in the brain and what must happen in the classroom to enable skillful reading. Most children learn to walk and talk naturally without a lot of support from adults. But reading is different. Reading is not hardwired in the brain, and the neural pathways involved must be developed through successful instructional experiences. Let's look at the reading brain. The parts of the brain that allow us to process sounds and recognize visual images are already in place at birth in the left hemisphere. However, the phonological assembly region is not intact at birth. This is the part of the brain that allows us to connect speech sounds with visual images, such as letters, and enables reading. And it must be built through explicit, systematic phonics instruction and practice with decoding.
Okay, I'm going to summarize what that video said. So, reading and research shows that the human brain is naturally wired for spoken language. But reading needs to be systematic, explicit, and direct. It needs to be taught. You need to learn how to read. Students require this type of learning in order to hold skills. Researchers have found that majority of students require this. And if we look here, there's actually tons of studies done, and the research has been around for over 50 years on how students learn how to read. It's not that we've been ignoring the research, it's just that we haven't put it into play.
And I think just to piggyback off of that, that notion that students need direct instruction to learn to read is not something that, I think we sort of drifted away from that in the education community over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
Drifting back, there are specific things that we need to do to help our students learn to read.
And it also needs to be systematic, meaning we need the scope and sequence. It also needs to be sequential. There needs to be a hierarchy of skills. You're not going to comprehend without knowing what the letters look like first. So there is a hierarchy of skills on how we learn to read.
I'm sorry, you said we had drifted away.
I'm going to
Oh,
kind of
okay.
get into that.
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay, this is an example of what direct explicit instruction looks like in the classroom.
Knowing and understanding. So today we are going to be learning about open and closed syllables. So what are we going to be learning about?
Open and closed syllables.
Wonderful. So how are we going to be learning about open and closed syllables? We are going to be using a blending strip to help us see the pattern of an open syllable and the pattern of a closed syllable. And we are going to be able to notice that there is a big difference between these two syllables. So, are we ready to get started?
Yes.
Be sure to be concise, consistent, and direct to allow all students to make those connections to apply these skills independently. So, if you notice with my blending strip, I am opening my door and then I am closing my door. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
And you're going to look at our syllable in front of us. Who can tell me, what pattern do you notice? What type of letters are we seeing on this card? Davis R?
A consonant and a vowel.
A consonant and a vowel. He's absolutely correct. What sound does this consonant make? K, k. Now, this is where it gets fun and interesting. If we have an open syllable, remember my door is open, well, guess what sound that vowel is going to be making? What do we think, Charlotte?
O.
You think it's going to make the O sound? So what would that be? Would that be short or long?
Long.
That would be long. So if we have a vowel at the end of our syllable, then we're going to have an open syllable. And that vowel is going to be long. Well, what sound is it going to be making? What do we think, Charlotte?
O. The long
Oh,
sound.
it's long sound. So when vowels make its long sound, they are saying their name. So who can help me out? How could I pronounce this syllable? Ava, what do you think?
Co.
Co, beautiful. Everyone say co.
Co.
Wonderful. So what pattern does our open syllable follow? We first have a consonant. Everyone say consonant.
Consonant.
And our open syllable ends in a
Vowel.
vowel. And our vowel sound is going to be
O.
O. And, of course, at the end of an open syllable, it's going to make its long sound, right? So think 1, 2, 3. What, how, and why.
So you can see how that teacher really broke down the rules of what it is of a closed and open syllable. The simple view of reading. So reading is a product of decoding and language comprehension. So when we look at decoding, we're talking about all of our foundational skills. When we talk about language comprehension, we're talking more of our knowledge build skills. And on the next slide, I'll talk about the difference between the two of them. And you really need both components in order to be a skilled reader. If you only have decoding, but you don't have comprehension, 100 times 0 is still going to be 0. Or if you have like comprehension, but you can't decode the words, you're still not going to be reading. Typically, our listening comprehension is much higher than our reading comprehension because we learn to speak first and listen, then we do read. Okay, so here's Scarborough's rope. And this also has become a term or an image that many of us have seen lately, thanks to the science of reading. And really what the science of reading is, it's research. It's a knowledge-based, vast research that has been in play for 50 years. and explains how children learn how to read. So when we look at Scarborough's rope, this illustrates how reading proficiency is woven through strands. It's almost like an image that we want to think about. There are foundational skills are on the top, decoding, phonological awareness, and recognizing words by sight, and then knowledge building skills are on the bottom. How do we teach students all of these skills? We do it through something called structured literacy. In the past, we used a lot of terms called balanced literacy, you might have heard of. Structured literacy is more direct and explicit instruction, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. So when we talk about how we're teaching students, we really want this to be, structured literacy, we really want to be our instructional framework because it's explicit, it's systematic, and it's cumulative. It's aligned with the science of reading, and it's also differentiated and tailored to each individual student. And what this does is it weaves together an array of skills and components into a skilled reader. And as we said before, these components are both foundational and core knowledge build. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the historical shifts in practice.
Okay, so for many, many years, reading has gone, so we actually went to a presentation and they said, don't use the pendulum idea, use the Ferris wheel, right? So all of these ideas are on a Ferris wheel, and then at certain points, certain ideas and certain ideologies come to the forefront and other things drop down. So just to kind of give a little bit of a history lesson, at the beginning, many 1600s, late 1600s, we started with the New England Primer, which really, there was some religious tenets to it too, but it focused on teaching students through more of a phonics base. So this would be introduction of alphabet, vowels, consonants, letters, syllables, and words, and that's what they used to kind of put forth a lot of information that was related to some religious practice as well. And then we kind of moved towards Horace Mann and more of a whole language push, and this Horace Mann is known as kind of the father of education and compulsory education and things like that. So Horace Mann, on the other hand, believed more in what we'll refer to and talk a little bit more about as whole language. And whole language is going to move away from kind of that phonics, direct, decoding type of work and more into focusing on kind of a natural process and what we'll call immersion. Like the more you're into books and reading, like you kind of incidentally pick up the information. And the focus is more on literature and just, again, being immersed in reading, and the belief that those skills come naturally as long as you have that deep immersion. And from there, we moved into the Dick and Jane books. So a lot of people remember them fondly. And part of the Dick and Jane movement was also an ability to get books, because if you know, like the whole one-room schoolhouse, right, the lack of materials and supplies. So this was also a way to have actual texts. So those texts were also, they were created by William Gray and Sharp, and they also believed in that whole word or whole language approach, also called Look-Say method. And through the publisher who was looking for curriculum and books, they were able to get those out there. The stories were very limited in terms of vocabulary, a lot of illustrations, and not a lot of new words were put on the pages. So those were the Dick and Jane books. And then Rudolf Flesch critiqued that idea of whole language and put out Why Johnny Can't Read. So this publication was attacking the idea of a lack of explicit phonics instruction in schools, and that publication put forth the idea that the low literacy and the inability to decode were connected. And then Jean Cha also kind of piggybacked on this idea that we were doing a disservice to students by not giving them that direct, explicit information, and argued that those methods of direct, explicit phonics instruction were way more viable than using the whole language instruction as well. So those two together were putting forth the idea that reading was not this innate process like listening and speaking were, that you had to explicitly teach it. So the interesting thing is, we still moved into balanced literacy, even though, right, those pieces of research and information were out there. And balanced literacy was kind of this, it was supposed to be this middle ground for everyone, where you take some of the components of phonics and you bridge it with the idea of like that immersion into text. So over the years, balanced literacy morphed, I would say, into just being more of an immersion in text, and the phonics piece was left out. And even when phonics was in play in a lot of places, it was not systematic, direct instruction. So even those schools and buildings, and Victoria and I always talk about when we were in the classroom, and I used to be a classroom teacher in the city for over a decade, and we were a teacher's college, which is based on balanced literacy district, and really the whole city was. And it was, we did do some foundational skills, but it was not systematic, I remember, right? It was more
Embedded, right?
right, it was embedded, or you might have had a little short program, but it was not like a scope and sequence. And some places in schools didn't have any, right? They just simply relied on Teachers College, which is Lucy Calkins, the Unisys study, which is also based on balanced literacy. So one big part of balanced literacy is the idea of 3Qing, which has been thrown out, so to speak, right? So you're not directly looking at the word to try to decode it. You're more so looking at the visual cues. Does it sound right? Does it look right? Like those type of things, which a lot of researchers attribute to actually poor reading and not a good reading strategy to figure a word out. So balanced literacy was at the forefront for many, many years. A lot of things, a lot of different ideas came about in terms of why, in terms of publishing, in terms of something that was, again, middle ground for people, and something that was also digestible for educators that they felt comfortable and confident in presenting and teaching. So now we're moving, as Dr. Borsella said, towards structured literacy. So again, it's important to note that none of the information about structured literacy or the research is new. It is well over 50 years. Again, if you go back to Flesch and Chall and that time period, that information was being compiled and presented. It just was not held on to and put into play in the classrooms. And generally speaking, a lot of, when it comes to educational policy, a lot of policy is left up to local control, and it's not really standardized statewide or federally in terms of mandates. So that's how we were able to kind of have all this information and still go back and forth, end up in balanced literacy, and now we're moving more towards that structured literacy of having explicit, direct, systematic instruction.
I would just like to add in, Ms. Diaz mentioned this notion of 3Qing as a system that was very common, especially with the balanced literacy. That technique for reading instruction has actually been explicitly outlawed. No, New York State, as part of Education Law 818, it says you cannot have a system that uses 3Qing as your literacy system.
Do we have that?
It was prevalent in just about every district, yes, including Port Washington.
Okay, so part of why we are shifting. We're shifting away from balanced literacy and towards structured literacy, and just to look at some differences in the two approaches. So the instructional approach related to balanced literacy is supposed to integrate phonics, whole language, level readers. It's kind of, and I don't say mixed bag in a derogatory way, but it's like a little bit of everything, right? It's supposed to balance everything. But again, when it comes to those foundational skills, phonological, phonemic, phonics, it's not explicit direct, as opposed to systematic, explicit, sequential instruction for structured literacy. So that's the instructional approach, that it's very different. In terms of phonics, again, under balanced literacy, more incidental. Under structured literacy, explicit, systematic, scaffolded. Decoding strategies, again, as Dr. Feeney and Dr. Borsella mentioned, 3Qing, which is meaning, syntax, visual, memorization, does not ask you to hone in on actually decoding, versus structured literacy, which wants you to decode and derive meaning. And visual and context in terms of balanced literacy, picture. So one big thing with relying on picture cues, especially as texts get harder, picture cues and pictures start to go away. And if you don't have that strong foundational understanding of how to decode, when there is no picture there, things start to fall apart, as well as not everything in a picture is going to give you an appropriate cue in terms of what it is that the word is saying, especially as more words get on the page and texts get harder. And structured literacy is asking you to use your decoding and understanding of the rules to figure the words out. So the most interesting thing, I think, of all for me is that there has been a lot of legislation, a lot of studies, a lot of even federally funded things that have come about over decades that have pointed us in a very specific direction, and yet we as a nation have not really acted on it until more recently. So the National Reading Panel was convened and put out a report that identified areas of reading, identified what you needed to do in those areas of reading, and pointed to systematic explicit instruction. So this is 2025, and they put this out in 2000, 2001-ish, around there. And with that information, it was put out, but nothing was mandated. No one was held accountable to enact it. And then was No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind, out of No Child Left Behind was Reading First. Again, proponents of scientifically evidence-based literacy instruction, which goes right back to the National Reading Panel's idea of that explicit systematic. And again, although that was put into place, nothing was mandated, right? It was put out there for people to have the information, and yet we still moved into balanced literacy. And then RTI came out in terms of looking at, and we have more to come on that, but RTI came out in terms of looking at your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I won't get into it deeply. Dr. Borsella is going to talk about a little bit about MTSS, which is the overarching RTI's academic component. And that also speaks to your tier 1, which is your basic classroom instruction, which should be explicit, systematic, evidence-based. And then ESSA, which is also a piggyback off of No Child Left Behind, which also is talking about academic standards. And if you look at our standards, it also speaks to the same decoding, systematic, explicit instruction. And then MTSS, which encompasses the RTI academic piece and the behavioral piece. Again, tier 1, that evidence scientifically based instruction. And now we're at Education Law 818, attestations. And this is for us in New York State in terms of impacting what we do. And just to give a little bit of additional information, a lot of states around the nation have now started moving towards structured literacy in very finite ways, whether it be legislation, whether it be commitments to teacher prep programs, educational training, professional development. A few things in terms of why the shift, NAEP scores for 30, 40 years have been basically the same. And that's just like a national reading score that comes about. Sold a Story, Emily Hanford, some of the Shifting the Balance pieces have come out. Mississippi has gone from 49th, I believe was the rank, and they've started utilizing some science and reading based literacy instruction, and they've moved way up to 29th in terms of the national reading ranking. And then a lot of parental groups have come about in the last few years, really advocating for a move towards science of reading, structured literacy based instruction. And then another thing that points to the shift is also the pandemic and kind of the lag and learning loss that has come about from the pandemic. So all of these are kind of creating the perfect storm, so to speak, to move us towards what science has been saying for decades.
Okay, next we're going to talk about our tiered system of supports. So MTSS, or multi-tiered system of supports, I like to think of that as the big umbrella. It's really a framework that encompasses the whole child. It's social emotional, academic, behavior, and attendance all come under what's the umbrella of MTSS. So RTI is the academic portion of MTSS, and this is our entry point. Here's where we're going to talk about our Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. You could go to the next one, I'll talk about the goals. Okay, so the goals of MTSS is to really make sure that we're looking at the whole child and that we're supporting the whole child through different increasing levels of tiers. So our Tier 1, which I'm going to really talk about on the next slide, but our Tier 1 is our universal curriculum support. And then if students need more structured or more tailored support, they would go into a Tier 2 and then into a Tier 3. Okay, so Tier 1, when we talk about Tier 1 in reading, we're making sure that all students receive that universal core curriculum. And that core curriculum should include our 6 foundational and knowledge build skills, the big 6. So it's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, and oral language. In addition to our Tier 1 curriculum, within Tier 1 we use a universal screener. In Port we used to use the NWEA, now we use iReady. That's our universal screener that we use 3 times a year. Also part of Tier 1 is progress monitoring students, differentiating our instruction in the classroom, and also having a solid 60-minute block of reading instruction. So when we look at Tier 1 should be between, I would say, 80–85% of our students should be able to read just using our Tier 1 core evidence-based, scientifically based curriculum. From there, we're going to go into the next tier, which is usually 10–15% of our students. Those students might need additional support either outside the classroom or within the classroom in small groups. So Tier 2 is going to be your targeted skills. From there, if students need even more support, they would go into Tier 3. Now, Tier 3 is not special education. A lot of people assume that once a student goes into Tier 3, it's a special education umbrella. It is not. All that Tier 3 does is it increases the frequency, changes the strategy, the program, the intervention that you're using, and it becomes more intense. It's more individualized at that moment. That's why people might think it reflects special education. It does not. You might have 2 to 3 students in a tier 3 group, and you're working on very specific targeted skills, such as R-controlled vowels. These 3 students do not understand R-controlled vowels. I'm going to put them in a tier 3 group because they were in a tier 2 group meeting twice a week, but they still don't really understand it. I'm going to have to use a more explicit approach, and I'm going to put them in a tier 3 group meeting 5 times a week, and that's the skill I'm going to work on. So it's really the levels increase in intensity as you move up. The classroom teacher within Tier 1 could also do Tier 2 instruction. All Tier 2 instruction means is that you're pulling students in a small group working on differentiated skills. So it could be done in the classroom, it could be done outside of the classroom. Tier 3 is always outside of the classroom and usually with a specialist, such as a reading specialist, a math specialist. But you're gonna have a whole RTI presentation in 2 or 3 weeks. Oh, I just gave this whole thing, okay. I kind of spoke to this. Tier 2 is your targeted support. The level increases with Tier 3, 1 to 5 students. It may lead to a referral for special education, but we actually just revised our RTI plan where we give a specific amount of weeks in between targeted skills that we're using with students. So for instance, if I'm a student within Tier 2 and I'm still not making progress, okay, I might need more support. So I'm going to go into a Tier 3 group. When you're in a Tier 3 group, you're taking what's called progress monitoring. You're taking data on that student almost every time you pull the child. So for instance, if I'm pulling a child all week and I see that, you know what, the student is not making progress, I have my data sheets in front of me, I'm seeing how the student is progressing, it doesn't immediately mean, oh, I'm putting the student for a referral. No, what we're gonna do then in our RTI plan is we're changing the approach that we're using. So if we're using one instructional method, I'm just thinking reading. If we're using like really great reading as a program, because of course it has to be direct, explicit instruction, I might say, you know what, I'm gonna move now to a Wilson group. So that's even more explicit. So that's how we move through the tiers with RTI.
And just I do want to add in, this was alluded to earlier, so for your Tier 2, you're looking at a target population, typically 10 to 15% of the population for Tier 2, and 1 to 5% for Tier 3, the most intensive. What we have found through data analysis over the last few years is we were a little skewed in Port Washington, much heavier, significantly heavier on kids who had been labeled for Tier 3 and Tier 2. The way you adjust that, of course, is through a stronger Tier 1 program and whole class intervention strategy, and that's a big part of the push as we work on these literacy skills.
Okay, our journey in Port Washington. Am I doing them? Okay, I'm doing the journey. Okay, so in the past, not only in Port Washington, but as Juanita said, we have been using a balanced literacy approach to teach reading. That's what we were taught in school when we graduated and went on to get our master's in teaching. That's what we were taught. We were taught a balanced literacy approach. So, like we said, our phonics instruction was embedded. So what that means is if I was doing a shared reading, which a shared reading would be a big book, and the students would be in front of me, and oh, I see the word at within the book that I'm reading, I might just say, oh, let me do a word family on at, and then show the students, oh, we can make the word sat, we can make the word cat. It was more of an incidental teaching of phonics than a systematic approach to teaching. So that's what we did for many years. Did we harm students? Well, I hope not, because I did that for 25 years when I was in the classroom, but students learn to read, but we realized that there is a better way, and the research shows that how students read I might have hit more students if I would have taught them in a direct, explicit manner versus those students going out for help. If I would have used the instruction at that time, which was based on the science of reading, maybe so many students would not have gone out for reading or math help. So that's what we've done in the past. Within our schools, we use various programs across the elementary schools. We also use teacher-developed writing units, and we did use some teachers' college units. Like Ms. Diaz said, when we were in the city, that's all we did was teachers' college. We had units of study, and we used them because that's what we knew at the time. Okay, so where are we now? So over the past year, we've provided professional development and resources aligned with the science of reading. We've implemented programs like Foundations, Bridge to Reading, and Magnetic Reading. In September 2025, this school year coming up, all 5 of our elementary schools will be using a phonics and phonemic awareness program for foundational skills, and they will be teaching students explicitly and directly in a systematic way. We have had a brief introduction to the New York State literacy briefs. We've had science of reading focus groups and book clubs such as Shifting the Balance. We provided resources to all the teachers, and we also have a PGCD, our reading subcommittee is now grades K through 5, and we plan to use a common set of curricular materials going forward, and you'll see that plan in the next couple slides. Okay, so what do these changes mean for students? The shifts mean greater consistency, no matter where you are, what classroom you're in, or what school you're in. More time for instruction inside the classroom, and everyone will have access to grade level content. We're really ensuring that all students receive a high quality education and high quality instruction within the classroom. Ms. Diaz is going to talk about reading proficiency and equity within our district.
Okay, so this is just a peek at the numbers for the last 3 New York State ELA administrations. So our orange bar is our overall proficiency rate. So our proficiency rate means that you scored a level 3 or a level 4 on the New York State ELA exam, which is quote unquote passing. So if we look at our overall rate, it's at 65%. And just to, if you see the little yellow post-it, it tells you the participation rate. So overall, in 2022, we had a 75% participation rate and a 65% proficiency rate based on those participating. ED is economically disadvantaged, so that's one subgroup. And if you look, the participation rate is 36% for those deemed economically disadvantaged, and their proficiency rate or passing rate is 34%. Hispanic, participation rate 35%, passing rate, proficiency rate 33%. Students with disabilities, participation rate 46%. Their proficiency rate was 35%, and ELs participated at 39% in 22, and their proficiency rate was 7%. So that goes across to 2023 and 2024. So just to kind of notate in terms of our participation rate for the last 3 years, overall it's been relatively consistent, 75, 71, 73. And the performance has been pretty consistent as well, 65, 66, 68. Obviously, you can see the subgroups have been relatively consistent as well, although clearly not as proficient subgroup-wise as our overall rate. And then obviously you see our L rate, not that it was good at all in 22, but it did take a dip as well in '24. So this kind of speaks to also what we are hoping to see change as we move towards that structured literacy. Yes.
I have a question. I understand that not all ELLs are Hispanic, and not all Hispanic children are ELLs. Is there any intersection between those two groups, or are the children designated as one or the other?
Well, you can be Hispanic and, to your point,
Yes.
and be an L and
But so
vice versa.
Is there double, in other words,
Are
there
they double
some-
represented?
Yeah.
are there some that are double represented?
Yes, there has to be. I haven't dug into it, but absolutely, yes.
There's spillover in all of those categories.
gonna say, it's
from
not just those
economically
two.
I
disadvantaged, yeah.
I was just looking at the really stark difference, and I was just wondering if you are, if a student is if a student is well, it wouldn't make sense to be categorized as Hispanic but not be an ELL if you are Hispanic and an ELL, as opposed to Korean and an ELL or something else.
Yeah, there is double representation. One thing we also noted, which you can see, is economically disadvantaged. You know, that's something to note as well, right? They are, there are, over these 3 years, they are doing even worse than some other subgroups and on par, when they don't necessarily have any type of language barrier, they don't necessarily have a disability, right, and they're still.
But they could if there's
They
a
could.
crossover.
They could, yes, they could. So we would have to dig deeper to get, like, delineate.
And it's worth, because you look at this, it's alarming, right? Especially some of the subgroup. This is an average across 3 through 8. It doesn't indicate the path in this chart. And a gentle reminder that, you know, last year, when we looked at our graduation rate, which was at 99%, there was no statistically significant difference in the subgroups in that graduation rate. So somehow, we managed to, you know, certainly with the class of 2024, you did not see a difference in the Regents Diploma in the graduation rate among those subgroups.
So the other thing I was going to ask is, given the low participation rates, so you have 36%, for example, of economically disadvantaged, that leaves 64% who are not taking these standardized tests, who are not represented here.
Correct.
And so is there anecdotal evidence from just the classroom as to how these groups are doing?
So that is an excellent question, and this is why our universal screener, administered 3 times a year to all students, there's no opting out of that, is such a crucial tool. And we'll talk more, not in this presentation, but this is what our universal screener data do not get reported to New York State. These data do, and we have to talk about them, right? They're out there, and anyone who can manage the New York State database, very user-friendly, can pull these up. So we can't really hide these, right? So we've got to figure out what's going on. Our universal screener has helped us drill down, and you know, the implementation of our new mathematics program has helped us with some of the instructional shifts to provide more Tier 1 support in the classroom, greater Tier 2 support in the classroom, mathematics classroom, but that will, at the elementary level, it's all the same classroom, right? So those instructional shifts will carry over as we work on literacy. So that is something we have our eyes on.
Thank you, Angela.
So here are just some stats. And it's important to note, right, like, for as much as we are looking at our numbers and information across the country, and I dare say the world, right, there are some things to be concerned about when it comes to literacy. And Dr. Porcella spoke earlier about the impacts of being illiterate or poor literacy. It reverberates throughout your life, to your health and to obviously financial and job and things like that. But just remembering that this is our, at least speaking of us, this is a national issue. And Specifically, 43 million Americans have low English literacy skills, difficulty completing tasks. And when you think about going into any place to do anything as a person living life, to have a low literacy level, it's harmful. So that's something to remember. And again, right, reading is an equity issue. It creates the kind of the basis for, as Dr. Porcella said earlier, incarceration and higher rates of a lot of different things that we're trying to combat. And that's, again, why we're moving towards the science and towards what we know is best practice.
And just point out that that 31% literacy rate, the proficiency rate is based on the national NAEP test, right? Not our New York State through 8 tests, which are indicating, our students are at about a 68% proficiency rate. So slightly different tools to measure that proficiency. There's some argument that the NAEP is a little more challenging and far difficult to reach, and maybe the New York State one's a little over measures. So, but they are different tools.
So this is like one of my favorite graphics because it tells you, right, when I think back, and Victoria and I have spoken a lot, right? You think back to classrooms, you use balanced literacy, you use other methods, and do some kids learn to read? Yes, even researchers will tell you that some kids will learn to read, some kids come to you reading, even like in kindergarten, and they're saying about 30%, no matter what you do, right? A Dick and Jane book, a balanced literacy, 30% of kids will learn to read. 50%, if you give them direct, explicit instruction, they need that to really learn to read. So you couple that direct, explicit instruction with kind of that 30% that will learn no matter what you do, and that compiles about 80%, which is actually on par with your RTI model of what Tier 1 is, right? So if we can get towards that direct, explicit instruction, we know for sure we can hit about 80%, right on target with our RTI model that's been put out. And then about 15%, again, which is on par with the RTI model, will need that additional Tier 2, and then Tier 2, Tier 3. And then you do have some students who are a little bit outside of those bounds, right? So even the research related to science of reading, it's all interconnected. I think that's why I love the graphics so much. It's all interconnected.
So moving forward, I get to speak finally. So we've talked a little bit about what the process is, but we do have we're in the midst of a 3-year plan for shifting the reading and literacy aspect of the district. We're working with the teachers to do that. Notably the PGCD Reading Subcommittee, which initially was formed as a K2 subcommittee. We got to push it to a K5 to really look for that consistency across those elementary years. Starting next year, although in the elementary school, we've put these pieces in place over the last few years, different aspects. We've brought in professional development. We've exposed people to the research. But every school, each one has its own characteristic. But next year, K1-2, within each elementary school, there'll be a consistent program, evidence-based, scientific-based, to teach phonemic awareness as well as phonics. They may be different among the 5 schools, but within each school, all the classrooms, they'll be the same. And that's really a foundation for, moving forward at a K5 level for consistent program across all 5 districts. That's where our goal is at the end of year 3. So professional development, the deep dive into the curricula, and we're going to have some programs to pilot as we move through this. 26, 27, next year, all elementary schools will be, yeah, that's the following year, 26, 27, right, so that 25, 26, and then 26, 27, after having selected pilot years, so this is in 2 years, this is year 3 of the 3-year process, we'll be piloting curriculum.
So we're year 1 right now?
We're year 1 right now.
Okay, that's what I was trying to
So
follow.
24, 25, year 1, 25, 26, that previous year slide, that's next year. That's year 2, and then this is year 3.
Got it.
So that's where we'll have the pilot, much in the way we did with our mathematics program. We had 3 programs running at the same time, 2 pilot, our existing one. We'll be doing something similar for the once we select that 26, 27 school year, there'll be some pilots, and we will select one during that year to roll out district-wide during the 27, 28 school year. So how do we get there? We've talked about the importance of professional development. You know, certainly you've heard me mention the notion of literacy coaches. That's going to play an important role as we begin shifting this model. I will say I have been so impressed with our teachers, because even as they are juggling a brand new mathematics curriculum and an instructional model, and they take great pride on teaching kids to read is nothing short of a miracle. It really is. And the work our teachers have done with kids is just incredible. But recognizing the science of reading and what the process perhaps could have been, and how, through no fault of their own, right, they are teaching the way they were taught to teach kids, being able, these veteran teachers, to be reflective and say, there are better ways to do this. And they're moving along, and they're pushing our district forward with us to push and be better at putting in place a systemic approach to reading instruction. So having those leaders as we begin that shift in each elementary school in the form of literacy coaches, it's an important component that will be down the road, that I just want to continue to plant the seed, and I'll keep watering it as we come by, and we'll see what grows. And certainly the collaboration among our district leaders, our school leaders, the principals, district administrators, and the professional development related to the implementation of the curriculum. This is all the prep work we're doing, where this presentation was laying sort of setting the table to give a clear understanding of what's at stake, what the background is, and we are laying a foundation for a successful implementation. And our commitment moving forward, we will have evidence-based instruction across all classrooms. We're going to have equitable access, and we have much of this, but we're moving from, and you all know what I'm gonna say, right? I don't even have to say it, our pockets of excellence to this overall umbrella. But it's true, right? I don't wanna give the impression that we're not doing a great work. We're not doing what needs to be done right now. We are. Kids are learning to read. And that graphic that Ms. Diaz put up shows that some kids, however, they're just gonna learn no matter what. But to reach all of the kids, we need to rethink our instruction and have a more systemic approach to it. We're going to, and we're working on our strong Tier 1 instruction, timely interventions, and ongoing support for our teachers through the coaching, as well as the collaboration. This ultimately is the best intervention. It's a well-trained teacher with the right tools. And we want to make sure they have the right tools as we continue to help them do the work that they're so passionate about. And that's that.
Thank you so very much. A lot to take in. We were very much looking forward to this conversation and these initiatives in our classrooms for our students and our teachers. So with that, I will turn it over to my fellow committee members.
I see her tapped page.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this. I learned a lot.
And one of the first things I was wondering, when you talk about equity in the classroom, kids come to school, some having been in a pre-K program, some not, some having learned to read while they were in pre-K or even before, some not. How do we best achieve equity in the classroom when children are coming in inequitably? At different levels,
That makes sense, yeah.
and also with different home life. Socioeconomic is usually a driver of success. They talk about zip code, but even within zip codes, the differentiation, the home life can obviously has their access, opportunity issues that some kids have, some kids don't outside of the school world. So how is all of that kind of, I don't wanna say leveled out, but how do teachers compensate, or I don't even know if I'm using the right words,
No, but I think we can control only what we can control, right? And one of the things that was mentioned in one of the slides, though we didn't really discuss it, is this notion that a part of the education law 818 is this literacy attestation, that we have to, as a district, attest that we are following, certain aspects, these pillars, that they're these big six, that we're following them in pre-K through, right now it's just grade 3, and we expect that to be expanded to grade 5. And we have to submit that to the state. And that was an important part of a workshop. We had a discussion, full day. We went with a couple of our teacher leaders as well. So that ensures that even in our pre-K programs, that not the daily pre-K, but the pre-K programs, if we have kids coming into a pre-K program, we've got to attest that these things are being followed. So that's the best way to sort of compensate at all levels for any inequities that are taking place outside of the school. It's not going to solve all of them, but it can at least help compensate. And some of those kids who come in with different things, they'll learn to read, period, because they've got that innately, they can do it. But the majority will need a direct systemic approach. And if we can give them that foundation in those early years, which are just critical, everything else about instruction just is so much easier for them in the years ahead.
That's why it's so important to have a Tier 1 curriculum in place so that all students have access to it. It's not, I'm in classroom A and I'm doing this, and then someone in classroom B is doing something else. That's how you create equity, is exposing all students to the same curriculum, and also having teacher differentiation.
the differentiation?
Yeah, so going in.
I wanted to just piggyback, like the explicit instruction, the slide where she talks about the different amount of phonemes, right? So if certain sounds don't exist in your language and you don't get explicitly taught how that sounds in the English language, that's problematic, right? Because that sound may not even exist in your language. Like certain things have to be explicitly taught for a child to understand, retain, and then utilize it. And I think part of the explicit systematic instruction is also, right, the actual practicing. Like if that video is shown, right, you learn this skill, this strategy, and you're practicing it. And I don't know what the number is, how many hundreds of times you have to hear words and vocabulary. Like there are so many components. We could have probably talked for like 5 hours, but it is this type of instruction that will help level the playing field for students that do come in different ways and maybe lacking certain exposure and experience.
Is there any attempt by the schools or the teachers, the principal, to reach out to parents who may not understand the value of reading to a child at home? Because some parents may not be culturally aware of it, they may come from a different culture or whatever, who may not understand reading at bedtime is a good thing, or is to foster that awareness. I mean,
there's a lot that happens now in the schools, and one school, one book initiatives started in one school is spreading to other schools. Those are important partnerships with with the parents. You know, we've got a school with a vending machine, a book vending machine. That's all sending messages. I think some of the more specific, explicit stuff, that's all part of the parent education piece. We have focused on district-wide, but an important part, we got to partner with the parents because, yes, absolutely, you know, reading at home to your child makes a huge difference. And talking about that importance is part of this process as we continue to educate not just staff members, but our parents as well.
So the next question I have, it may be a question for Ms. Zarate, and that's fine, you don't have to answer it here. But I read somewhere that if a child is not literate in their, I wanna say native language, but that's not the word we've been using, right? But the language,
Their home
a foreign
language.
language, it's
Their
their
home
foreign language,
language.
their home language, it's going to be very difficult and more difficult for them to become literate because they don't have the foundation in one language, and so you're often teaching a child who's much further along in speech, but not necessarily literacy. How do we handle that here, or is that a question for Ms. Zarate?
So I think it really depends on the age level as well. I think anyone who's learned a different language, I know as someone who's learned multiple languages, you learn a different language, you actually develop a better understanding of your home language, your home tongue. At least that's been my experience, and I know with other people I've spoken. At a young age, if you've got this, if you have this explicit direct instruction, however, it may be challenging, but okay, so they may need additional support in the form of a tier 1, tier 2 instructional support, but it's reachable. You know, those kids are reachable.
And in September, one thing that we also put in place was that our ELL teachers are going to be mimicking 10 minutes of foundational skills within their groups. The same, you know, curriculum that the classroom teacher's using. So they are going to mimic those same skills.
Oh, sorry.
That collaboration between the ENL teachers and the classroom teachers at the elementary level has started and is strengthening, and that's an important piece. Thank you.
When my daughter was in elementary school, she's now in college, but we were assured NWEA, that was the holy grail. And 3 times a year, that's how we're gonna do it. And now we're hearing, no, not so much. So is iReady going to do what we need it to do? And I have to be
Listen,
skeptical because,
NWEA was not the problem.
okay,
So we administered it, not across all grades. We sort of dropped off a little bit in the upper grades. But the challenge with NWEA was the results to action. So you could get the results as a teacher and they were not easily transferred. It required, 4 or 5 steps before you could put those results into practice. So what's nice about iReady, it's diagnostic, it's the way it's linked to the mathematics program. It tells you, oh, these are some weak skills. Give that lesson on this page. It is so much easier for teachers to go from, here are the curricular areas, here's where your child, this student is a little weak, here's what you can do about it. NWEA, going from standards to practice, it took 3, 4 steps. And that was a lot of work to ask teachers to do for their, 23, 24 students, whatever it might be. And iReady makes it a lot easier. So there are 2 things that are different with iReady. We are doing a far better job at actually looking at the data and having meetings about the data with the principals with the level leaders, and talking about what progress kids are making, and not using it solely as the cutoff to see who needs RTI, but okay, well, this one doesn't need RTI, but here's where they are. How do we get that student up here? So NWEA can be used for that. We just weren't using it because it was far more circuitous to get to where we needed to. It's a lot easier with iReady, and I think we've shifted. There's been a culture shift in how the data are used, and we've got principals buying into it, and the teachers, And that's the huge difference, so.
And are we seeing results? With the end user being the child, the student, are we actually seeing this whole program with the data and the targeted?
I gave in the board packet a couple weeks ago, I did give a sort of an overview of where we are in some of the areas of growth, and it has been very encouraging. We have just wrapped up our third diagnostic of the year. We have a meeting with our team to go over the areas of growth, what worked, what didn't, so we can plan next year. This stuff, those sort of meetings were not happening with NWEA. So it's a different, I don't want to blame NWEA. There are districts that use it and use it successfully. We weren't using it the way it needed to be used. We're using the iReady diagnostic the way it should be used.
That's right, because having all the data is nice, right? But unless it's actually helping the
Used.
child, right?
Right,
Right,
we need
then
to use it, and not just for the kids to find out who needs RTI, this baseline, the iReady data for all those kids, because if you're down here, we want you to grow, but if you're in the middle, we want you to grow as well, and that's what we've been able to do.
Okay, I have one more question.
Yeah.
So scaffolding, all these programs, do they properly scaffold from whatever grade you start them in, pre-K or kindergarten? Are we talking to each other from elementary to secondary? Because our middle school, we've always said, and even in ninth grade, when kids were getting to Schreiber, and this is going 10, 15 years ago, there was always an outcry of a lack of literacy skills even in ninth grade. So are we following this? Are we building properly? And are we not only consistent laterally in the elementary schools, but are we building properly up and continuing to look at the middle school and the high school?
As we work at the elementary level, that's an important aspect, you pointed that out. But there are changes also at the middle school, not as systemic, but yeah, we will see what happens. And this is why we wanted the K-5 committee, which in our view was critical to have that consistency, and we will be scaffolding. That's the key is, you know, people get worried. It's not that we want the exact same thing done in every classroom, but there are tools, there are approaches. We can't have students learning one approach to reading, which is what was happening in the second grade or the first grade, and then they have a totally different strategy with a new teacher in the third grade. You want a consistent experience for the kids so they don't have whiplash, and they can build on the techniques and the strategies they used before. And these strategies need to be all, based on the science of reading, not on, such as the 3-cueing methods, right? We all read to our kids, right? Could my son, as a 2-year-old, actually read Brown Bear, Brown Bear? No, but he knew Brown Bear,
Yeah,
right?
by
Because of the
heart.
way,
Yeah.
of course, right? But,
Same.
you go from Brown Bear to Hungry Caterpillar, you don't have that, the phonemic awareness to do that, so.
I'm sorry, I have one more question. I was mistaken. Because you said something and then I keyed in. So our elementary schools are not K through 6. If our elementary schools were K through 6, would this literacy program be going K through 6? And if it were, what are we doing about 6th grade at Weber?
If the elementaries were K through 6, I suspect that our reading committee would be a K-6 committee, and would have some consistency. In the 6th grade, much as we are, we implemented mathematics, iReady Math this year, K-6. And in the 6th grade, that was the toughest year, right? Because there's no buildup. And the kids are coming to a brand new program, so there's sort of that 6th grade has been more hybrid than some of the other grades. Other grades have really been consistent in using iReady. So there's that transition time for the middle school. And we would expect the same thing here, as a lot of these skills, and as we are looking at that, and the middle school is doing a much better job looking at the iReady data and trying to discern where the weaknesses and what supports can be provided.
Thank you, sorry.
You're fine. It's so sort of connected to where Deborah was just going. I'm wondering about, because we do hear about kids in middle school and high school who I'm assuming are in that smaller part of the pie graph
Yeah.
where they needed a certain kind of instruction, they didn't get it, or there were some other barriers. And so they're still below where they should be.
Yep.
So with all this shift, will we also be shifting for them and trying to grab them now and give them this level of instruction?
That's already happened in the middle school. We've got new support programs in the middle school that were put in place this year. This has been a discussion. And even at the high school level, in terms of trying to figure out what the kids need, working with, certainly Ms. Mills at the high school, Dr. Bear, and Ms. Mesba, our Director of Special Ed.
So I would imagine it's potentially a little harder to identify those kids, right, at the middle school and high school level. Are we relying on teachers to identify them? Is it these
So
evaluations?
the
you know, they
screeners
take
stop right
screeners
now
late,
for grade 8, but we are looking to extend the screener, the ELA one, into high school to help with some kids who could benefit from some screening to give us a better sense
Oh, that's great.
of where they are. We have kids who are below grade level in terms of reading at the high school, absolutely. And, we are both aware of it, concerned about it, and taking steps. Because I will add, once again, you don't want to have to clean up, mop up at the high school. We want them to come in as with as strong a foundation as possible. But the high school has done a remarkable job, getting some targeted interventions to support kids so they can get through some of the exams and graduate with a diploma.
Well, and I think probably to all of us, the implication is clear here, which is you set the correct foundation. In 5 years, we won't have this conversation about the middle school and the high school
Yeah.
because we'll already have
Yeah.
dealt with everything early. Like, that's the goal.
It is no secret that my background has primarily been secondary. I have not needed to focus all that much on the intricacies of literacy at K-1-2. And that's why, very fortunate to have both Dr. Borcella and Ms. Diaz as experts to collaborate with and work with, as well as some of our incredible teachers who have really been leading other teachers on this really crucial foundational work. That it's going to take a little bit of time for it to trickle up to the high school, but there'll be a difference.
I mean, it seems to me that, like so many things, this is a consistency issue,
Yeah.
right? Because we had differences in what children were receiving. One more quick question, just out of curiosity, how long has the PGCD reading committee existed?
On and out. I mean, they pop up every now and then, but this iteration started last year.
Okay.
Initially as a K-2, and then we got it switched to a K-5.
And to your point, prevention is much easier than having to help students, right?
Intervention.
I couldn't get the word out. I'm like, help, what's that word? I had like a block.
The knock on our state tests has been, I'm already seeing you shake your head, the psychometric reliability, validity. It's always been it's a thorn in my side. What I'm curious about, to help us as board members, to help the community, have we done a deep dive into the difference in subgroups in the global results of ELA versus where our students really land on our quality universal screener? Is there a difference?
So that's part of our work this year, absolutely. But I want to point out that we've also taken a look at, what you've said about the 3 through 8 tests. There are clearly some problems with it. So we always try to say, okay, well, if we've got these problems, other districts have the same problems. So let's see where we are compared to other districts. And, you look at some of the passing rates. The overall passing rates, Port's not in some grades we're, maybe in the top third, other grades maybe in the middle, overall not too bad. We kind of fall apart with some of the subgroups. We're really not doing as well as other districts are. There's not a district in Nassau County that's not struggling with the ELLs, quite honestly. Top-rated districts are getting a 50% proficiency rate. We saw 52, 53 in Nassau County with their ELLs. That's 7%. Our ELL proficiency rate right now is landing us at the bottom. So, that's indicating that there's stuff we can do, other districts seem to be doing, that perhaps we need to do to reach some of our subgroups. So
is that a plan that's being developed with Ms. Zarate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But a lot of it has to do with this instructional approach and having all of our ENL teachers teaching some of these core foundational literacy skills is an important piece of that work, which they've already started.
So I have a couple others. It will, for the board, I think all of this conversation is both about concern for our students, but also what do we financially budget for and plan for, and will we be ready? So can we expect details on what the budget impacts are going forward and what we should be doing and thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just as, when we wanted to provide the professional development support this year for our new mathematics program, that was an extension, and the board got some information on that. Certainly, as we are shifting to a more consistent approach for this K-5, there'll be materials that need to purchase. As we have purchased materials over the course of these past few years, at the end of the day, we've different materials for different teachers, different schools. As we move to a consistent one, we may have to replace a lot of materials. That's going to be a budgetary expense that we need to plan for. I mentioned the desire to provide at the elementary level instructional coaches. That has certainly budgetary implications, and professional development. That professional development, depending on whether we have those instructional coaches. We're very lucky to have a district level leader as we are focusing in on literacy, and really two of them. But with Dr. Borsella, that's her laser beam focus. So absolutely, we for this to be successful, we will need the board's support. Which is why we spent time really setting the table, and in many ways this was like a little mini lesson, because not everybody has the same vocabulary and understanding of what this is. I certainly didn't when I first arrived here.
Right. In terms of the tier 1 versus tier 2, you mentioned that some of that can be provided by the classroom teacher. Is it also being used as a push-in model versus a pull-out model?
Yes. So this year, some of our reading staff are pushing into the classrooms. It also depends on the child, right? How does the child learn? Does the child learn with minimal distractions? That might have to be a pull-out, but we would love it to be push-in and teachers collaborating with reading instruction. And I think math is now a push-in, correct?
Right, the shift overall in the district is to have more push-in services, and you have some huge benefits for that. You can, if you're not pulling the student out, right, that student can stay in the whole class and continue to receive that instruction. From a language point of view, that is better for the students. You, as a classroom teacher, you also have a larger amount of protected time because you have your whole class together. I have been in classes that have, in schools where they've used the push-in model both for ENL as well as mathematics. And you've got the classroom teacher, but then you have a math specialist coming in, you have your ENL person. All the kids stay in the classroom, they are getting their targeted support, and they can, the teacher has their whole class together. So push-in is the way. You speak to Dr. Allen, that's how we're looking to provide more of our special ed services whenever we can. There's some kids, both mandated and really required to have pull-out, but in the past, we were using almost an exclusively pull-out model. And that's not really best practices, which is where we're shifting now. And next year, Manor Haven's going to be shifting even more for ENL to a push-in. Some of our other elementaries as well will do more push-in services.
And we also have to remember that our Tier 1 instruction, when we look at Tier 2, it's not in place of Tier 1. So everyone still needs to get Tier 1 instruction, and when you pull out for Tier 2, we want to make sure it's minimized so that students aren't missing the Tier 1 core instruction. Because that's the way to close the gap.
Right, and that's been, as you mentioned earlier, that's been the shift in the mathematics support. Our math specialists used to, all the kids, Tier 2, Tier 3 would be sent to the math specialist, but we've really moved to the Tier 2 being push-in services and provided also by the classroom teacher. And the instructional model of iReady has supported that and its ability to take data and help teachers create small group instruction, which is a lot of what you need, that environment that you need for good Tier 2 support.
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly where we're heading.
And just an extension of what you had brought up, Dr. Allen, so again, our data for those subgroups is also concerning. So is she part of this team plan as well?
Yes. Yeah, we've had a number of meetings when you get to the MTSS, providing some support and looking for a plan district-wide to support our transition to the larger MTSS. We've been focused and we're gonna have a whole presentation on RTI at the end of this month. MTSS is the bigger umbrella, right? RTI is the academic component of the MTSS. And Dr. Allen and I, and we've had the principals as well as Ms. Diaz and Dr. Borsella looking at ways of supporting an MTSS initiative across the district.
So it's really the team of 5 then?
It's
right?
a lot.
It's Dr. Allen, the 3 of you, and Dr.
Right.
Ms. Zarate?
Ms. Zarate's she's got to be part of that as well.
Never seen
Right?
it, thank you.
So those were basically my questions. Should we move it to the community? And we have current and future board members, so this is perfect. Sandra?
Hello, thank you for that. I'll preface, I have 5 questions. 3 of them, hopefully 1 sentence answers, 2 maybe longer. So for Ed Law 818, does it pertain anything with special education instruction as far as what's required for what literacy program they're using?
It doesn't speak to special ed.
Okay, so technically within Port Washington, any of our resource room teachers or self-contained classes could be doing some antiquated teaching as far as
Yes.
3 cueings. Okay, is that going to be something potentially that future committee,
It has to stop. We have to verify that those practices are not taking place. So,
would that be the committee or is that Dr. Allen? Like, what is the plan for that? Because you have the committee that's going to be doing the review to see which will be the one for all 5 elementary schools. Okay, the question was answered. You're on it, yes, okay. That was the one simple one, it's one. Okay, so for I appreciate the data that was shown for the 3 years. That was for the 3 through 8. Will we see the K through 3 reports similarly set up the way that you demonstrated it today?
right, so we could, but of course, the state testing is 3 through 8 now.
But that showed 3 through 8. That
Yeah,
said
for the
3,
state
8,
testing.
yeah.
So there's no state testing in K-1-2, of course. But if we do an overview of, say, our iReady, our
Yeah, that's right.
universal screener,
Yeah.
we could present something like that, and that might be a good thing for next year's work.
Yeah,
for the committee.
Ms. Brooks alluded to the fact that some students are coming in kindergarten differently.
Yep.
But certainly we have a full year with them in kindergarten and a full year with them in first grade. So I'd love to see what it looks like once they're in our district for a full year, 2 years. Not all students are in with us that whole time.
One thing that I do love about iReady, that's a shift from NWEA, which is also, I think, a valuable thing to present, is they do designate students by I can't think of the word.
I know.
The grade, there's a term, but like the grade, so they'll say that you are early kindergarten.
Emerging.
and then- Right, and then at the end of the year, you could be early first grade. So that level of, instead of just looking at a scale score, it's a good way to look at World 2, so that could be part of like a K2 person.
Which I appreciate that, because the one thing, you brought it up unintentionally throughout the questioning, but the one thing that I found difficult for me to gauge with that report was it was in retrospect to just the subgroups, right? So we just saw what Port students did overall versus the subgroups, but we had no reference point of versus Nassau County versus Long Island versus the rest of New York. So that was just hard. So that was very telling when you mentioned the 50% in other Nassau County districts for the one single subgroup of the Yale. Again, it helps me as a trustee to see the full picture, not necessarily to give you 30 more questions. So I hope you know that it's more to have a well-rounded understanding of the information. Even though I have 5 questions today, it's not really for that. So it just, single trustee, that would help me just overall to kind of understand that. With that said, the only question would be is if this came up in curriculum a while ago, if Universal Screener is going to be shown to us in a future meeting. The only thing was with iReady, this year the choice was made to not allow for accommodations. So I understand that the results may look a certain way, and I'm just wondering what kind of dialogue will happen once results are shown based on subgroups, and if there's any further look into those accommodations for future years.
I'm not sure we're going to the accommodations. We need to see where the kids are, and what we are looking for in particular is what sort of growth. So.
If you switch, it will be hard to gauge it, right? So,
Right.
which I totally understand, I'll know that didn't have the accommodations. So Ms. Melkonian asked it, I'm gonna ask it a little bit more direct. So the data shows the subgroups need more, right? There's no way that data can be skewed differently or put in an adult information. That's the data. And as you said, that's local, not just Port Washington. You also had to present one of the slides on how the legislation has grown to make sure that districts have an obligation to do more for those groups and all students. So aside from a consistent evidence-based, scientific-based program in all 5 elementary schools, which is obviously needed and will elevate all middle students as well, is there anything else that is being done elsewhere or needed or will be presented to us at a future date that is getting done by this district for those subgroups?
Yes, there is. In reading, we've used a consistent program and approach to look at Tier 2 and Tier 3 students. Our teachers went out and all had built-in training for Tier 3, which is your most intensive, and consistent programs that align with what the school is doing. So if the school is using foundations, then the teachers are using something that's related to foundations, and it's also direct instruction, explicit, and scientifically based. So we make sure in reading that they're using the same
I want to
interventions.
Push-in, I think another part of the push-in is ensuring that the students, it sounds small in words, but when kids are constantly pulled out for different services, they're often missing the basic parts of the instruction, right? Like whether it's what we're trying to shift to or not, they're missing a lot of that Tier 1. So by embedding more push-in and moving towards that, there are like all these prongs that we're trying to like just bring together to this like beautiful picture. And I think that the push-in, the tier 2, tier 3 training, in terms of those two pieces together alone, I think will shift a lot, particularly because to your point, when it comes to socioeconomics and all those components, those are our kids that are most represented in that 50% that need that direct instruction. Those are the kids that are part of that cohort, and if we can get to them through all of these measures, the research, not us because we believe it, the research says that they're going to grow.
You know, it's funny that you say about the push-in, so I have a question about Wilson, but with the push-in, just so you know, as a parent, some view the use of the change of push-in versus pull-out as a budgetary need. And the PR of like the real understanding of why push-in is done for push-in, I don't think gets across to all parents. And I wonder how that can be better articulated the way you just did. And maybe, and parents, some parents like myself don't ask the question enough to say like, to understand it more. For Wilson, is it required training or requested by the staff?
Requested.
So not necessarily everyone's actually getting trained for Wilson,
There is one reading teacher in each school. That
Okay.
is-
for Wilson.
Yeah, we had to make it even playing field for everyone.
That was 2 years ago, right?
Yes.
Yep.
This isn't necessarily a question for today, but more of a comment. The Title I funds heavily used this year were for iReady implementation, which benefited all students. I look forward to seeing what strategies are gonna be used this coming year to elevate our students who are unintentionally being left behind, potentially in these Title I schools. So I know that's not been presented to the board yet, but I'm just, you know, Ms. Melkonen asked like the budget and what we're doing and what we're looking at. I will patiently wait to see how those funds will be used as well. And then the only question I had, like this is a broader question, I don't need an answer again, but maybe for the committee or for your department, but I'm just curious to know how this presentation will be presented to the board in the future. So if it's gonna be an annual, is this gonna be next year? And will it be the same setup or something different as we got the background information this year? And just how it looks for future presentations.
Right, I don't think a future presentation will be as pedantic as this one, right? The hope is we've all learned and we've developed a common language. So, you know, if the board wants a presentation, we'll put something together.
Or the
So
committee,
that's,
yep.
Right, or the board can decide, as,
Yeah.
you know, as a group of 7, we decide what topics we wanna cover in the evening meetings, either
Right.
way.
I also, an important piece, right? We talked about Wilson and then the push and this and that. The simple fact that we're really looking at the data in a way that I don't think we have
Okay.
necessarily done. There is this is part of a cultural shift, right? That is, it's taking place, it's not done, but we're getting more buy-in into the importance of looking at the data and being smart about it.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? So I've been assuming in my head, and based on Sandra's questions, I want to verify that I'm assuming correctly, that when we're talking about subgroups, and we looked at that pie chart that said 30% can learn in any way, 50% with this systematic instruction, and then I think it was 15, there we go, with additional, I've been assuming that any student that falls into any of the subgroups and has an additional barrier that they're overcoming for any reason is likely not in that 30%. And so this shift to teaching in a more methodical way, making sure there's consistency through grade levels and being with this explicit and direct instruction, that piece alone may have an impact on a lot of the subgroups. Is that, I'm seeing you nodding?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ms. Malwani?
Thank you. I mean, you've asked a lot of my questions already, so thank you. I did just want to say, Dr. Barcella, something you said earlier really struck me. You know, that you had been using the traditional approach for 25 years and then had to ask yourself, am I harming, or was I harming children this whole time? And I can only imagine how difficult it is for educators to ask that of themselves and then to be open to changing the way they approach their students after a 25-year career. So I am very grateful that you are all sort of, leading our district, and that our teachers and our educators are asking this for themselves. So I'm very grateful for that openness. I was also grateful for this pie chart, and I heard that as well from the board members. We've seen the ELA, the aggregate data 3 to 8 over many years. We've seen it, beyond 2022 even, and it's always hovered. I mean, it's remarkably consistent, which always left me wondering, like, is this our ceiling? Is this the best we can do? And I was very grateful to hear that it's not, and that we have this kind of 80% give or take benchmark that we can be working toward. And I think keeping that in the back of our minds will be very helpful as we look at this year to year. My only real question, and Ms. Brooks asked several of them, Ms. Gillier followed up, was really about Weber, because it's going to be about 6 or 7 years before we see kids entering Weber who have had the benefit of this instructional foundation. That's a really, really long time. I was happy to hear that there are changes being made at Weber to address this, but I'm very sort of conscious of this pie chart, and of those 50%, let's say we're just looking at those 50% who did not receive the explicit and direct instruction that they needed in elementary school, how we're kind of targeting them to at least help over the next 6 to 7 years get those kids up to a point where they can enter high school feeling confident and at grade level. So that's kind of where my mind is.
And I spoke, the reading teachers at Weber have been working, and they did bring in new programs to help support reading teachers at a school-wide level. And this has been a little tougher sell with parents, but there's been a review of, okay, here are the kids right now that are scheduled for these sort of interventions. And in some cases, we had students whose performance on the universal screener indicated, you're really up here, and it may be nice to have that extra reading class, but it would probably be better, you not get it, smaller reading class, we can focus on those who aren't there, but here. So actually removing the RTI services from kids who are used to having it but are performing at a level that no longer warrants them having it. And those are shifts that have happened, this year. And Weber will continue to look at it. So no, we clearly, the elementary, that's foundational, that's critical, but we can't just sit and wait. We're doing all this great work at the elementary, we'll just kick back and wait. No, it's at Weber, it's critical as well.
And I know we are, yes, we're using the iReady diagnostic for ELA, but my understanding is that classrooms are actually using the MyPath as well for iReady ELA.
Some of the classrooms are, correct.
Yeah, and some, I know at Manor Haven, there are a couple of grades that are doing sort of an early pilot of the iReady curriculum. I'm wondering, have we seen any early outputs of that? Anything that gives us hope or optimism that we are in fact heading in the right direction?
We are encouraged by the growth that we have seen, certainly over the first 2 administrations of our universal screener. We have not fully looked at the, we've all taken sneak peeks, but we haven't, since we're still wrapping it up, we haven't looked at all of that. The score reports should go out this week to parents, and then we have our meeting. It was scheduled this week, and I think we have to move it to next week.
We have a double meeting. We have a embedded specialist meeting followed by the data person for iReady as well.
Good, thank you.
Well, thank you all. This was
Very informative.
It's informative and exciting and frustrating, as you're saying, because this is we're not going to see this overnight, and we know that students are here and ready and now, and so we appreciate all of the work being done by our teachers and by your leadership in really making a massive shift. So we're hopeful and look forward to the great results that we will share this first year in. So thank you.
Thank you.
And next month, this
Yes,
month,
this
our
month,
next
yeah.
meeting is scheduled for
The 20?
June 20th at 10 a.m. and we will be discussing the new RTI plan, which will be a wonderful piggyback to this. So thank you and looking forward to that.